I want you to imagine, just for a second, that you are standing in a peaceful, modern-day park, specifically downtown park in Pleasant Grove, Utah.
Okay, I can picture that.
Yeah, so there are, mature trees, manicured lawns, maybe some families having a picnic, and right there, just blending into the scenery, is a stone monument.
Right.
If you walk up and read the plaque, it says it's in commemoration of Utah's first Indian battle.
Which sounds so tidy, like a neat little historical footnote.
Exactly. A neat, finalized piece of pioneer history. But when you bypass that plaque and actually read the primary sources, the pioneer diaries, the military records, the oral histories of the Timpanogos Nation, that phrase starts to feel incredibly heavy.
It really does. Because beneath the grass of that park lies a history of just profound ecological collapse, fractured diplomacy, and, well, deeply asymmetrical violence.
Welcome to today's deep dive. We are unpacking a massive stack of these complex sources to really understand the violent collision between Mormon settlers and the indigenous Timpanogos people in 1849 and 1850.
Yeah, our goal today is to reconstruct the timeline of these events. We're going to unpack the historical debate over whether these encounters were battles or massacres and, impartially examine how both sides justified their use of force.
Okay, let's unpack this. We usually think of wars starting with a political assassination or maybe a broken treaty or an invasion.
Right, the usual suspects.
But the sources point to a completely different catalyst here. The conflict actually started with blades of grass.
Yeah, the ecological shift is the true starting line here. I mean, before 1847, the Timpanogos Nation was a highly prosperous hunter-gatherer society.
They were doing incredibly well.
Exactly. They lived in a carefully managed harmony with the Utah Lake ecosystem, which they called Timpanogos Lake. And this wasn't just like a place they happened to wander through.
Right, it was their home.
It was. They'd engineered a highly sophisticated system of harvesting. They relied on specific seasonal cycles, millions of fish spawning in the rivers, native game migrating through the valley, and vital root systems that grew in the undisturbed topsoil.
Then, in 1847, the Mormon pioneers arrive. And to understand their mindset, we really have to look at what they were running from.
Which is a lot of trauma.
So much trauma. They had been violently driven from states like Missouri and Illinois. Their founder had literally been assassinated, so they were desperately seeking a religious sanctuary.
A place to build what they called the kingdom of God.
Right. They wanted a place completely isolated from the outside world that had persecuted them.
So now you have two completely incompatible paradigms of survival occupying the exact same valley.
It's a recipe for disaster.
It is. The native culture relied on sharing resources and localized ecology. The settler culture relied on exclusive land ownership and agriculture. And the mechanism that forces these two worlds into conflict isn't initially a weapon.
What's the livestock?
It's the cattle. The settlers arrive with massive herds of European cattle, and they just turn them loose in the valley.
It makes me think of pulling the bottom block out of a Jenga tower.
Oh, that's a good way to put it.
Because the native ecosystem relied entirely on those native grasses and the roots beneath them, the settlers' cattle acted as an invasive species.
Yeah, they didn't just trim the grass. Their hooves churned up the topsoil, and they ate the vegetation all the way down to the root.
Once that foundational grass block was pulled from the Jenga tower, the native game had nothing to eat, so the deer and elk just relocated.
And the root systems the Timpanogos harvested for winter food were decimated. The entire indigenous food web collapsed almost overnight.
Which leaves the Timpanogos facing sudden, catastrophic starvation on land that had sustained them for centuries.
It's heartbreaking. And the sources actually include a really stark observation from one of the settlers who recognized the grim mechanics of this. He wrote, "It is really a matter of necessity with these Indians that they starve or steal."
Think about that. Imagine someone moves into your house, empties your fridge to feed their own family, and then calls the police when you take a single apple from their counter just to survive.
That perfectly illustrates the tension.
Taking the cattle wasn't some crime of malice. It was the only block left in the tower. They began hunting the only animals left on their land to keep their families alive.
But the settlers, who are hyper-defensive and terrified of failing in this harsh new environment, they don't see starving people utilizing an available resource.
No, they see hostile thieves.
Right. They see thieves attacking their private property and threatening their fragile colony's survival. They fundamentally misunderstood this indigenous concept of shared ecology.
So two incompatible views of land use just colliding head-on.
Exactly. And that ideological clash ferments for about 2 years, until March 1849, when the situation violently boils over at a place called Battle Creek.
And the trigger for this violence is based on a phantom offense, which is just crazy to read in the sources.
A completely false rumor.
Right. A rumor starts circulating through the settlement that a renegade band of Timpanogos had stolen horses belonging to Brigham Young, the leader of the settlers.
But the historical record shows the horses hadn't been stolen by anyone. The settlers' own herdsmen had simply moved them to a new pasture to graze and just failed to communicate it.
So it was just an administrative error?
Basically, yes. But even after receiving word that the horses were likely safe, the momentum for a punitive strike was already in motion.
They just couldn't stop the train once it left the station.
Yeah. Captain John Scott leads a militia of roughly 35 to 44 men to track down this perceived renegade band. And they are actually aided by a Ute leader named Little Chief.
Okay, wait. I need to pause here because I'm trying to wrap my head around that detail. Why would a native leader actively guide an armed, angry militia toward another indigenous band?
It sounds contradictory, but the sources indicate it was a decision made out of pure existential dread.
Oh, wow.
Little Chief was acutely aware of the militia's firepower and their anger. He was terrified that if he didn't cooperate, the settlers' retribution would fall indiscriminately on his own peaceful camp.
So he was essentially a hostage to the situation.
Completely. He cooperated to shield his own families from a massacre. So he guides the militia, and they track a native leader named Roman Nose and his band to a ravine.
Right. They surround the encampment before dawn. The Timpanogos are trapped in a freezing creek, heavily overgrown with willows.
And the militia demands a surrender, but Roman Nose refuses. He steps forward and is immediately killed.
And this is where we really have to critically examine the terminology used in the historical record. Like we said earlier, the monument calls this a battle.
Yeah, a battle implies a relatively mutual fight.
Right. So what does this all mean? When you have 40 armed militiamen surrounding 17 people who only have one old hunting rifle, at what point does a fight become a massacre?
That's the crucial question. I mean, let's at the mechanics. Most of the 17 people were women and children.
The sources detail how the native men tried to run up the freezing creek to escape the crossfire. One man, known as Blue Shirt, nearly broke through the line.
He was running incredibly fast, but he was gunned down, shot 18 times.
18 times. 4 native men were killed in total. 0 settlers were harmed. And the 13 women and children who survived by hiding in the freezing water were taken as captives.
So from the settler perspective, they recorded it as a punitive military skirmish against cattle thieves. It validated their use of force.
But from the Timpanogos' perspective, it was a senseless killing. It was an outgunned, trapped group being executed.
Exactly. Using the word battle sanitizes the reality of asymmetrical warfare. It frames a slaughter as a mutual military engagement.
You would hope that the sheer horror of that encounter might act as a deterrent for future violence, like a wake-up call to force both sides to the table.
But it didn't. It acted as an accelerant. It completely shattered whatever fragile trust remained, which leads us directly into the spring of 1849 and the aggressive occupation of Utah Valley.
Shortly after Battle Creek, the settlers advance further south and construct Fort Utah right in the heart of Timpanogos territory.
And the construction of this fort involves a profound diplomatic betrayal.
Here's where it gets really interesting and just tragic. The histories record that a settling interpreter named Dimmick Huntington met with a prominent Timpanogos warrior, Chief Onkar Tuetz.
To try and secure safe passage, ostensibly.
Right. And Huntington allegedly raised his right hand and swore an oath to the sun that the settlers would not take their lands or infringe on their rights.
Swearing an oath to the sun is perhaps the most universally binding symbol of truth across indigenous cultures. It implies a promise witnessed by the heavens themselves.
And almost immediately after making that sacred promise, the settlers build a fortified military garrison directly over it. You can see exactly why the Timpanogos felt completely betrayed.
They realized they weren't dealing with travelers passing through. They were dealing with an occupation force.
And that tension just builds and builds until January 1850.
Which is the breaking point. A beloved Timpanogos elder, known to the settlers as Old Bishop, is murdered by 3 Mormon men.
And the motive is just absurd.
It really is. They accused him of stealing a shirt.
A shirt? They shoot an elder over a piece of clothing. And the brutality of the cover-up is what escalates this into a full-blown crisis.
To hide the evidence from the indigenous population, The three men eviscerate old Bishop's body, fill his stomach cavity with heavy river rocks, and throw him into the Provo River.
It's just horrific. And when the Timpanogos eventually discover what happened, they retaliate, but they do it by their own legal parameters, right?
Right. They don't immediately attack the fort or kill settlers in revenge. They take approximately 50 head of settler cattle.
Because in their culture, taking property was a standard method of seeking restitution.
Exactly. It was a way to balance the scales of justice for a severe wrong.
But inside Fort Utah, the settlers don't see it as restitution. They see a hostile insurgency draining their winter food supply.
Which brings us to February 1850 and the core debate of our deep dive. The Fort Utah siege and how this extreme use of force was justified.
On January 31st, Brigham Young meets with his leaders and issues what historians refer to as an extermination order. The minutes record him saying, "I say go and kill them."
And Daniel H. Wells, the commanding officer, orders the militia to exterminate hostile clans who do not sue for peace.
So from February 8th to the 17th, we have the siege at Fort Utah. And the asymmetry from Battle Creek is just magnified here. The settlers are literally using cannons against indigenous families armed primarily with bows.
The death toll is staggering. Between 40 and 100 native men and at least 1 or 2 women are killed.
And only one militiaman dies.
Just one. But the violence doesn't end with the gunfire. The sources detail a grisly aftermath.
The beheadings.
Yes. Up to 50 of the slain Timpanogos men are beheaded, and their heads are collected and put on display at the fort to terrorize the women and children held prisoner inside.
It's so disturbing. Even if we look at the settlers' claim of self-defense for their cattle and colony, how do the sources justify the beheadings? It feels like the justification of protection morphed into something much darker.
To understand that, we impartially analyze the justification of force from both sides based on the sources. Let's look at the settler justification first.
Oh.
They believed they were acting in self-defense, yes. But that was heavily influenced by the doctrine of discovery and manifest destiny.
Can we break down the doctrine of discovery? Because it's a term that gets thrown around a lot in history.
Yeah, it basically traces back to 15th century papal bulls. It established a legal framework that if a land was inhabited by non-Christians, it was legally classified as empty.
Like a massive legal loophole.
Exactly. And over centuries, this morphed into the religious belief of manifest destiny, that God gave them this land to build a sanctuary.
Making the natives an obstacle to divine will.
Right. When survival is framed as a holy war, extreme violence can be rationalized.
Yeah.
Plus, U.S. Army officers in the region actually endorsed the action, so the settlers felt legally and divinely justified.
But then we look at the indigenous justification for their use of force.
From the Timpanogos' perspective, they were defending their ancestral sovereignty. They were defending their food supply and their very lives against an invading force that had just murdered their elder and stolen their ecosystem.
They were just fighting to exist. We often treat these dates, like 1849 and 1850, as if the story ends when the smoke clears.
But actions have consequences.
Right. The trauma of these massacres plants the seeds for Utah's bloodiest conflict years later.
The sources have this deeply human detail from the Battle Creek Massacre. During the chaos, a young native boy is forced by the militia to fetch their one hunting rifle.
But he breaks the stock in defiance before handing it over.
Yes, that boy's name was Nuance. He was taken as a prisoner of war.
And years later, fueled by the bitterness in his heart over the senseless killing of his people, that boy grows up to be war chief and Tonga Black Hawk.
If we connect this to the bigger picture, it shows that historical trauma doesn't just fade away.
It really doesn't.
When you leave a people with no choices, when you wipe out their families and force them onto reservations, that grief inevitably transforms into organized resistance. He leads the Black Hawk War from 1865 to 1872, a massive conflict born directly from the unhealed trauma of Battle Creek and Fort Utah.
It makes you consider how the history we think is in the past is actually the foundation of the world we live in today.
It's all connected.
So to wrap up this deep dive, we've traced the timeline from an ecological disruption caused by cattle to the devastating massacres at Battle Creek and Fort Utah.
We've debated the grim realities of asymmetrical fights and explored how both sides justified their desperate actions for survival and sovereignty.
I want to leave you with one final provocative thought to mull over, based on the source material about geographical renaming. The site of the bloody Battle Creek Massacre was very quickly renamed Pleasant Grove by the settlers.
to erase the violent history of their foundation.
Exactly. Think about the town you live in, the streets you drive on, and the parks you walk through. What pleasant groves are you passing through every day, completely unaware of the history buried right beneath your feet?
It's a heavy question, but an important one.
It really is. Thank you so much for joining us on this deep dive today.
Take care, everyone.